There's a mirror in the east corridor of the Palace of Holyrood House that the staff don't talk about. Not because they've been told not to. Nobody issued a memo. Nobody pulled anyone into a back office and said, keep your mouth shut about the glass. It's more that when you work a place long enough, certain things become part of the texture of the walls, absorbed, unremarkable to everyone on the inside, quietly extraordinary to everyone who stumbles in from the outside. I stumbled in. My name is Daniel Marsh. I was 26 when it happened, doing a 6-month placement with the Royal Collection Trust, the department that catalogs, conserves, and occasionally argues about the provenance of objects that have been sitting in palace rooms since before most countries existed. My job, specifically, was assisting with a photographic inventory of the smaller decorative items in the residential corridor of Holyrood House. Wall sconces, occasional tables, picture frames, the kind of work that sounds impressive at dinner parties, but mostly involves kneeling on cold floors with a reference clipboard. I want to be precise about what I saw. I want to be precise because I've told this story maybe a dozen times since then, to my sister on the phone, to my flatmate over takeaway, once to a historian at a conference who looked at me like I'd said something in a language she didn't speak. And each time I tell it, some people hear the words and understand them, and then there's that pause, that specific pause, where they decide whether I'm the kind of person who is interesting or the kind of person who is unwell. I'm fine. I was fine then. I had slept adequately, eaten a reasonable breakfast, was not on any medication, had no particular history with the supernatural or the dramatic. What I had was eyes, and the eyes saw something. It was the 3rd week of October. Edinburgh in October is a specific kind of gray. Not the flat gray of a city that can't be bothered, but a layered gray like pewter poured over pewter, with the castle up on the hill making the whole sky feel deliberately theatrical. The leaves in the palace gardens had gone the color of old coins. The tourists still came, fewer of them now, and they moved differently than the summer crowds, slower, more deliberate, like people who chose to be there rather than people who were passing through. The East Corridor was closed to public access that week. Conservation reasons. We had the run of it, myself, a senior conservator named Helen Gould who'd worked at the palace for 11 years, and had the particular calm of someone who'd long since stopped being impressed by anything, and a photographer named Rory Telfer who wore the same wax jacket every day and narrated everything he was doing under his breath like he was filing an internal report with himself. Right. Sconce number 42. Brass. Mid-19th century. Crack on the mounting plate. Photographing now. That kind of man. I liked him. You want someone like Rory on a job like that. There's a specific comfort to excessive competence that doesn't require conversation. The corridor itself was long. Not palatially long, not the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles long, but long enough that the far end felt like a different temperature. Tall windows ran along one side, looking out over a courtyard. On the opposite wall, at intervals, there were paintings, more sconces, 2 ornate side tables, and then, roughly 2/3 down the corridor, the mirror. It was large, maybe 5 feet tall, 3 feet wide. The frame was gilded. Proper gilding, not gold paint, the real thing, built up in layers and burnished to something between warm and serious. The glass itself was old. You could tell by the way it caught light, slightly differently than a modern surface would. Not a clean bounce, but a softer, more complicated thing, like it was reflecting you, but also thinking about it first. Helen cataloged it before I arrived at that section. Venetian glass, she said. Probably 1780s. She handed me the reference sheet without looking up from her notebook. I photographed it from the front, logged the measurements, noted the minor foxing in the upper left corner, moved on. I was 3 items further down the corridor when I realized I'd logged the wrong height measurement. Wrote 148 centimeters instead of 184 centimeters. Transposed my own numbers. I walked back. The guard was standing in front of it. I hadn't noticed him come in. There was a connecting door to the adjacent room at the corridor's midpoint, and staff moved through it throughout the day. He was in full ceremonial dress. The scarlet tunic. The bearskin hat. White gloves, the whole thing, which was slightly unusual for the interior of the palace during a conservation closure, but not impossibly unusual. There were public engagements being prepared for that week, dress rehearsals for a ceremonial event whose details I was not privy to. His name, I would later find out, was Corporal James Whitmore. He was 31. He'd served for 9 years. He was from a town in South Yorkshire whose name I've since forgotten, and he was the kind of quiet that reads as reserve rather than vacancy, the kind of quiet you earn. He was standing at a slight angle to the mirror, not facing it directly, something between facing it and facing away, the way you look at something when you're not sure you want to be caught looking. I was about to say sorry to interrupt and get my measurement when I stopped. In the mirror, his tunic was blue, not the red of the uniform he was wearing. Blue, a deep, formal blue, like the dress uniform of a different regiment entirely, or of a different era. The bearskin was the same. The white gloves were the same. But in the glass, the scarlet was gone. I stood there for what was probably 4 seconds, but felt considerably longer. He shifted his stance, moved his weight from one foot to the other, an almost imperceptible adjustment, and the mirror changed again. Now the tunic was gray, a field gray, the kind of color that belongs in photographs that have already gone sepia at the edges, not in a living man standing in a lit corridor. I said something. I don't know what. Some vowel sound. My mouth opened, and whatever came out was not English. Corporal Whitmore turned around. He looked at me. His expression was not startled. It was not the expression of someone who had been caught doing something strange. It was the expression of someone who had just been interrupted during a task he'd been doing privately for private reasons and was now weighing up whether the interruption was worth engaging. Then he looked at the mirror. Then back at me. You saw it, he said. Not a question. I still don't know why I said yes. The reasonable thing, the self-preserving thing, was to say sorry, wrong corridor, and back out of the room and tell myself I'd had a funny moment. Instead, I said, "What was the blue one?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My great-grandfather." He didn't elaborate. Not right then. He turned back to the mirror, and I watched from where I was standing. I hadn't moved. My feet had made some kind of independent decision to stay put, and he shifted his angle again. Smaller adjustment this time. A few degrees. The tunic in the mirror went black. Not uniform black. Not the black of formal evening wear. A specific, structured black with high collar details that I recognized distantly from the catalog work I'd been doing as Victorian morning dress. The kind worn by household staff. The kind worn by people who serve in grief alongside their employers, who wore their employer's sorrow on their own bodies as a form of professional devotion. "There," Whitmore said. His voice was even. "That one I don't know." I had, by this point, crossed the corridor to stand beside him. Not close, a respectful distance, the distance you maintain when someone is doing something private and you are technically present for it. We both looked at the glass. My own reflection looked back at me normally. Navy jumper, khaki trousers, clipboard, vague expression. "No surprises." "How long have you known about this?" I asked. "Third time I've been in this corridor," he said. "The first time I thought it was the light. The second time I brought a torch and ruled that out. What do you think it is?" He looked at me. It was a measured look, the kind that scans for sincerity before committing to an answer. "I think," he said, "that the glass remembers." Helen found us, standing there about 12 minutes later. She came through the connecting door with her notebook, and that particular walk of hers, heel first, deliberate, slightly percussive, and stopped when she saw the two of us side by side in front of the mirror. She looked at Whitmore. She looked at me. She looked at the mirror. "Ah," she said. "Now what's going on? Not should you be in here." "Just you've seen it too," I said. She was already writing something in her notebook. Not looking up. "I have a note in the condition report," she said, "that the glass exhibits anomalous reflective behavior under certain angles of ambient illumination. That's the professional language. And the unprofessional language?" She capped her pen and, finally, looked at me. Her expression was the expression of a woman who had long ago made peace with the fact that some things don't have satisfying explanations, and found that peace, if anything, clarifying. "The unprofessional language," she said, "is that this mirror shows you what you should have been." The corridor was quiet. Outside, through the tall windows, a starling landed on the courtyard wall and left again. Corporal Whitmore didn't say anything. He put on his white gloves, I realized he'd been holding them at some point, had taken them off without my noticing, and straightened the front of his tunic. "I need to get back," he said. He walked to the connecting door, paused with one hand on the frame. "The blue one," he said, without turning around. "My great-grandfather served in the King's Royal Rifle Corps. That's their color." He paused. "He died at Passchendaele, before he was 25. He left." The door settled shut behind him. Helen went back to her catalog notes. Rory, somewhere further down the corridor, murmured something to himself about bracket alignment. I stood in front of the mirror for a while. My own reflection stood back at me. Navy jumper, clipboard, the same. But for just a moment, right at the edge of it, in my peripheral vision, I thought I saw something else. Something darker. Something that might have been a collar turned up against cold I'd never felt, belonging to a version of me that had made different choices, gone different places, stood in different cold. I didn't look directly at it. Some things you know, without being told, that you're not ready for yet. I wrote down the correct measurement, 184 centimeters, closed my clipboard, and walked the other way down the corridor toward Rory and the sconces and the ordinary, blessed, manageable work of cataloging things that stayed the same when you looked at them. I didn't go back the next day. I want to be honest about that. I made a deliberate choice to work at the opposite end of the corridor. There were enough items on the inventory list I could justify it to myself and to Helen and to no one else in particular. I photographed a series of landscape watercolors that had nothing to say for themselves. I cataloged a side table with a small repair to one leg that someone had done competently, but not brilliantly, possibly in the 1940s, and I wrote that up with more thoroughness than it warranted. I was buying distance, because the thing Whitmore had said, "The glass remembers," had sat in my chest for the whole of that evening, and through the night in the way that certain sentences do. Not like a thought you're actively processing, but like something that's settled into a place slightly below conscious reach, humming. My flatmate, Sasha, asked me at dinner why I was being weird. I said, "Long day." She said, "You look like you're doing maths." She was right. I was doing maths. The specific maths of whether to go back and look again versus whether looking again was the kind of decision you make when you're the kind of person who is fine. I went back on the Thursday. Thursday was overcast, properly overcast. The kind where you can't identify a sun's location in the sky. Just a flat, everywhere brightness that makes Edinburgh look like it was designed by someone with a very specific and melancholy aesthetic vision. Rory was off sick. It was just Helen and me, and Helen was working at the far end of the corridor when I came through the connecting door with my clipboard and pretended to be checking reference numbers. The mirror was exactly as I'd left it, which sounds obvious. It's a mirror. It doesn't go anywhere, but there was something in me that had half expected it to have changed, to have gone back to being ordinary, to have decided that the whole business was done with, and it was ready to behave. It hadn't decided that. I stood in front of it. My own reflection. Normal. I moved. Very slowly. A few degrees to my left. Nothing. A few more. Nothing. I was about to decide. I'd imagine the whole thing. Relief and disappointment arriving at exactly the same time, fighting for the same square inch of my rib cage, when I moved once more and the reflection shifted. Not the tunic this time. I wasn't in a tunic. I was wearing my usual work clothes. But in the mirror, my jumper was gone. In its place was a shirt. High-collared, white, the kind with a stiffness to it that suggests starch, and a formal occasion. Over it, a dark waistcoat, buttoned all the way up. The kind of ensemble that belongs to a very specific slice of British history. Not the far past, not Victorian. Edwardian, maybe. Something in that range of 20 or 30 years that always gets swallowed by the more dramatic decades on either side of it. I looked like a clerk. The kind of man who kept someone else's records. Who knew where everything was and was never thanked for it. I stared at this. The reflection's face was mine. No question. Same eyes, same jaw, same tendency of my hair to do something complicated on the right side. But the posture was different. Straighter. The shoulders carrying something that my actual shoulders currently did not. A kind of practiced, professional straightness that comes not from comfort, but from daily choice. Then, a voice behind me said, "I thought you might come back." Whitmore was in the doorway, not in full ceremonial dress this time, a more practical uniform, the working day version. He looked, if anything, younger without the bearskin, or maybe just more human. The bearskin had a way of making the men who wore it into symbols rather than people. He crossed the corridor and stood beside me, and we both looked at our reflections. In the glass, where my waistcoat version stood, his reflection stood in the blue again. The King's Royal Rifle, Corps Blue. His great-grandfather's regiment. It's always the same one for me, he said. No matter what angle. The same blue. How do you feel when you see it? He considered the question carefully. I appreciated that. He didn't reach for the quick answer. Like I owe him something, he finally said. Which is mad, isn't it? He's been dead over 100 years. We never met. I didn't choose to survive instead of him. It doesn't work like that. And yet, we stood with that for a while. The light from the tall windows had shifted, a break in the clouds somewhere, sending a long bar of thin October sun across the corridor floor. Not reaching the mirror. The mirror sat in its own quality of shadow, doing what it did. Has Helen told you anything else about it? I asked. She doesn't talk about it much. Once she said it was in the inventory records from the 1700s, which means it's been here longer than anyone now living has been alive. She said there was a notation in an old ledger. She didn't show me, just told me, that one of the palace housekeepers had asked for it to be removed. 1910, something like that. Asked for it to be taken down and put in storage. What happened? It's still here, he said, which was not an answer, but was also completely an answer. I want to tell you about the waistcoat version of myself, because I think it matters. I had, at that point in my life, been accepted to a graduate program at the University of Edinburgh, and then not gone. This was not a secret. I've been offered a funded place in art history, which sounds like the kind of thing people say at dinner parties right before they ask if the risotto is good. And I turned it down because of a combination of factors that I'd told myself were practical, and that I understood even at the time were mostly fear. Fear of being wrong about whether I was the kind of person who could do it. Fear of finding out I wasn't. The specific, quiet cowardice of not starting something, because not starting it means you can't fail at it. So I was doing the placement work instead, which was good work. I wasn't resentful of it. But there was a question that lived in me, the way a stone lives in a shoe. Not always felt, but there felt again whenever you step wrong. The man in the mirror was wearing a clerk's clothes, keeping someone else's records. I'm not saying the mirror was telling me something. I'm not making that claim. But I'm also not going to pretend that I didn't understand what I felt, standing there, looking at a version of myself who had chosen to stay small and useful and safe and feeling recognition. That specific recognition you feel when a story about someone else is actually about you, and you weren't expecting to be ambushed by in a palace corridor on a Thursday morning. I looked away from the mirror. I'm going back to university, I said, out loud, not to Whitmore. He didn't know any of this. Not really to him. To the air in the corridor, maybe to no one in particular. Whitmore looked at me. Good, he said. Simple as that. Like he understood without needing the context. Maybe he did. We talked for a while after that. Not about the mirror, or not directly. We talked about the kind of things you talk about when two strangers have shared something uncomfortable and need to find solid ground on the other side of it. He told me he'd joined the army at 22. Not out of family pressure. His father had been an accountant, his mother a school librarian. Nobody had pushed him toward it. He just found himself at 21, sitting in a flat in Sheffield with a degree in geography that he wasn't using, working a call center job that he wasn't suited for, and thought, this is not the shape my life is supposed to be. So he'd enlisted. And was it? I asked. The shape. He thought about it. Most of it. The bit where you serve, yeah. The bit where you're part of something that's bigger than your individual feelings about Monday morning. Yeah. The ceremonial stuff? He paused, glancing down at his uniform. It's an honor. I mean that genuinely. But it's also a costume. Sometimes it's hard to remember the difference. I thought about the mirror, about his reflection in that blue tunic, about how a reflection might not see the difference between a costume and a uniform at all, might only see what the cloth represents, stripped of the wearer's ambivalence about it. What do you think your great-grandfather would make of all this? I asked. The ceremonial side of it. Whitmore made a sound that was almost a laugh. I think, he said, he'd think it was nice work if you could get it. He died in a field. We stand in palaces. There's not really a way to make that feel fair. He said this without bitterness. It was a plain statement of an uncomfortable arithmetic. Helen appeared at the end of the corridor. She didn't approach the mirror. She stood at the far end with her notebook and looked at us and did that thing she did, that calibrating pause before she decided how to proceed. And then she walked toward us at her usual pace. She stopped a few feet from the glass. "Both here again," she said. "Comparing notes," Whitmore said. "That's one way to put it." She looked at the mirror, just briefly. Then she looked at the floor, which was a thing I'd noticed her do before. The specific avoidance of someone who has made a decision about what they will and won't engage with. "You've looked at yourself," I said. "Properly. At an angle." A pause. "Once," she said, 4 years ago, a colleague accidentally left the connecting door open, and I walked through without thinking, and I was at the wrong angle, and she stopped. I cataloged it the next morning, and haven't looked at it directly since. "What did you see?" She was quiet for long enough that I thought she wasn't going to answer. "I saw myself without this place," she said finally. "Without the work. A version of me that had never come here, never taken this job." I looked. She chose the next word carefully. Unoccupied. Like a room with the furniture moved out. Nobody said anything for a moment. "I don't know what that means," she added, which I believed. "I suspect it's not metaphysical. I suspect it's optics. Old glass does strange things to light, and the brain is a pattern recognition engine that will find stories in static given half a chance." She looked up. "That's what I suspect." "But," I said. "But," she said. "Yes. But." She turned and walked back to the far end of the corridor without finishing the sentence. She didn't need to. The but was the whole thing. The but was the reason none of us were talking about this the way you'd talk about a maintenance issue. I left the palace that evening as the light was doing its final thin performance over the castle. Edinburgh's early dark, early October. By 4:30, it's already suggesting night. I sat on the bus back to Newington and thought about the man in the mirror in his clerk's clothes. I thought about Whitmore and his great-grandfather's blue. I thought about Helen standing in a room with the furniture moved out. I thought, what does a mirror remember that we don't? Not our faces. We know our faces, or we know the reversed image of them, which is close enough. Not our clothes, not our choices. Maybe, and this is the thought that sat with me all the way back to the flat, that sat with me through dinner and through most of the night, maybe what the glass keeps is not a memory at all. Maybe what it keeps is a question. The question every person who ever served in that palace, who wore livery in that corridor, who polished that mirror's frame, who stood on cold stone floors in the dark before the house woke, maybe every single one of them carried some version of the same question. Is this the life I was supposed to have? Is this the shape of it? Is this the whole thing? Or is there another version in some other room, waiting? The mirror just reflects it back. You bring the question, the glass give it a face. I went back to university that January. I want that on the record. Not because the mirror told me to. I don't believe in that kind of causality. But because sometimes you need to see the version of yourself you don't want to become, rendered clearly, without the comfortable fog of rationalization. The waistcoat, the straight-back clerk, the kept records. It was a fine life. For someone. Not mind I should tell you about the last day. Because there was a last day, and it was specific, and it happened not to me, but to Whitmore, and I was there, and I have spent the better part of 3 years now deciding whether telling this part is something I'm allowed to do. Whether it belongs to him in a way that makes it not mine to give. I've decided that it does belong to him, and I've decided to give it anyway. Because some things are too important to stay quiet about just to protect your own sense of propriety. It was the second week of November. The inventory project was almost finished. We had 4 items left in the East Corridor, a pair of wall-mounted brackets, a small portrait of a minor royal whose identity was listed as possibly attributed to, and the mirror itself, which had a small note in Helen's ledger indicating that a second condition survey was needed before the project closed. Whitmore was not supposed to be there that morning. I know this because he told me, later, that he'd asked to come. that he'd told his superior officer he had an administrative matter to attend to at Holyrood House. Not a lie, exactly, but not the whole truth either. He'd arranged it specifically. He wanted one more time with the mirror before we finished, and the corridor reopened, and the ordinary foot traffic of tourists and staff made that kind of quiet standing in front of it impossible. He arrived before Helen. Before me, in fact. When I came through the connecting door with my coffee and my clipboard, he was already there, already standing at the mirror, and something about the way he was standing stopped me at the threshold. He wasn't at an angle this time. He was facing it directly, square on, not doing the slow drift and adjust that he'd done before. Just standing there, looking at his own reflection in the straight-on, unambiguous way. His reflection was in red, the regular uniform. The one he was wearing. His actual self, perfectly replicated. He was crying. Not dramatically. This is not a story where that kind of crying belongs. Not heaving or audible. Just the specific thing that happens to a person's face when something long held finds its way to the surface. The eyes going bright and strange, the jaw doing a small amount of work, the effort of keeping it contained visible in the effort itself. I stood in the doorway and did not move. He reached out and put one white-gloved hand flat against the glass. His reflection did the same. Red tunic to red tunic. Glove to glove. Him and himself, divided by 40 centimeters of old Venetian glass, and whatever the glass had shown him, and whatever he decided about it. I don't know how long I stood there. Not long in clock time. Long in the way of things that feel important. Then he dropped his hand and straightened and turned around. He saw me. He didn't flinch. He'd passed through the stage where being seen would have embarrassed him. You could tell that it was visible in his face, and whatever was left on the other side of that was something quieter and harder and more his own. She was right, he said. Helen, it's not metaphysical. I waited. It's a question, he said. That's all it is. Just a question that I've been carrying around, and the mirror makes me look at it instead of carrying it. What's the question? I asked. He put his gloves into his breast pocket. He looked at the mirror one more time, at his own red uniformed reflection, present tense, accurate his. Whether I'm enough, he said. Whether what I'm doing now is enough. Whether my great-grandfather would think it was enough, which is mad, because I didn't know him and he's dead and it shouldn't matter, but he stopped. But I said, but it matters. He said it plainly. No apology for it. It matters because he gave everything he had, and I'm standing in a corridor in a scarlet coat that no one's going to fire at, and the question is whether that dishonors him or honors him. Whether living, just living quietly, doing the work, doing the ceremony, whether that's its own form of the thing he did. I thought about Passchendaele, about a man, not yet 25, about a field in Belgium whose mud became famous for swallowing people. I thought about a great-grandson in a palace corridor, asking the mirror whether being alive was a sufficient answer to what had been sacrificed. I think, I said carefully, that surviving in his place is not a debt you owe him. I think that's the wrong frame for it. Whitmore looked at me. I think you being here, I said, in his regiment's successor service, in this building, doing this job with this much care, that's not you paying a debt. That's you carrying something forward. That's different. He was quiet for a long time. Then, he said, where did that come from? I don't know, I said, but I believe it. He nodded. Once. The nod of a man filing something away where he can find it again. Helen arrived 20 minutes later, and the three of us completed the second condition survey of the mirror in complete professional silence. Helen measured. I logged. Whitmore, who had no official role in the process, held the measuring tapes end against the frame without being asked and stood very still throughout. Frame, gilded, original surface, minor losses in lower left corner. Glass, Venetian, circa 1780s, foxing in upper left quadrant, 2 minor scratches on reverse, reflective surface intact. No anomalous behavior noted. That last line was Helen's. I watched her write it. She did not look up when she wrote it. She wrote it with complete composure and underlined it once, lightly, and moved on to the final item on the list. I did not argue with the notation. There are professional truths, and there are other kinds. Helen had spent 11 years here. She understood the distinction better than I did. The corridor reopened the following Monday. Tourists came through in the usual groups, the guide at the front speaking in that particular register. Informative but not too slow, enough detail to feel immersive, not so much that anyone's attention actually wavers. They walked past the mirror. Some paused in front of it, as tourists do in front of large and gilded things, and looked at their own reflections with a mild interest to people who are checking that they are still themselves after a morning of looking at things that are old and valuable. Nobody stood at an angle. Or maybe they did, and nothing happened for them. I don't know how it works. I don't know if it's the person, or the question, or the specific quality of the light, or whether October and November do something to the glass that the other months don't. I don't know if it was ever real, in the way that real is usually defined. What I know is what I saw. What I know is what Whitmore said. What I know is what Helen wrote, and what she didn't write, and why. I finished the placement, went home for Christmas, came back in January, and enrolled for the graduate program I should have enrolled in 2 years earlier. It was harder than I expected, and better than I expected, and neither of those things was surprising. I got a message from Whitmore about 8 months in. He'd found my email through the Royal Collection Trust staff directory. I was still technically on their books as a freelance consultant. The message was short. He said he'd been transferred. New posting, different palace. He said the move had been good. Then, he wrote, I thought about what you said, about carrying something forward versus owing a debt. I've been thinking about it for 8 months, and I still think you were right. I wanted you to know that. That was it. No further correspondence. It was enough. It was more than enough. Some messages are complete the way a door closing is complete. Not an end, not a loss, just a room becoming its own thing again. I went back to Holyrood House once more, about a year after the placement, just to walk through on a public tour, the way anyone would. The corridor was open. The mirror was there. I stood in front of it. My own reflection. Normal. Me, with a year of graduate school sitting somewhere in my posture, maybe a fractional straightening, maybe nothing visible at all, maybe just something I was telling myself. I moved, just a little, a few degrees to the left. Nothing. A few degrees to the right. Nothing. I stood there for a while. Maybe the question was answered. Maybe that's how it works. You look until you don't need to look anymore, and then the glass goes back to being glass. Or maybe the question is always there, and the looking is what changes. I don't know. I walked to the end of the corridor and through the door and into the courtyard where the October light was doing its pewter thing, and the leaves had gone coin-colored again, and I thought about Whitmore and his new posting, carrying something forward, and about his great-grandfather in a Belgian field who had no way of knowing that the thing he gave would be carried at all. I thought about Helen in her room without furniture. I thought about the girl in a different palace corridor 100 years ago who asked for the mirror to be taken down and was not listened to, and whether she had seen something in the glass that terrified her, or whether she had seen something that moved her in a way she couldn't afford to be moved, and had asked for the mirror to be removed the same way you asked for a letter to be unsent. Too late, too much, better if it simply wasn't there. The mirror was still there. It will probably outlast everyone I've told this story to. It will probably keep asking its question in an empty corridor long after the last person who brought their own question to it has stopped needing the answer. That seems right, actually. That seems like what it's for. Not to provide an answer. Just to show you clearly in that old, complicated, thinking about it glass, that the question is yours, that you've been carrying it, that has a face, and that the face is yours. The last thing Whitmore said to me in that corridor before we parted ways, and Helen went back to her notes, and Rory came back from his illness, and the work returned to being ordinary work. He was putting on his bearskin. That slow, deliberate process of becoming the symbol again, becoming the uniform, the ceremony, the red figure at the gate that tourists photographed and children stared at. He got it settled, adjusted the chin strap, pulled on the white gloves. Then he looked at me, and he said, very quietly, the way you say something you're not sure you believe yet, but are practicing believing. It's enough. What we do. It's enough. He walked out of the corridor and into the palace and into his life, and I stood in the quiet for a moment, and I thought, yes, it is